The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a town that had seen better days. The wooden buildings stood weathered and worn, their paint peeling like old scabs, while tumbleweeds danced between the hitching posts. It was the kind of place where secrets festered in the desert heat, and today, those secrets would begin to unravel. Cowboy sat on the porch of the saloon, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee that had long since gone cold. At 43, his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much, lost too much. His dark eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his worn hat, watched the street with the vigilance of someone who knew that trouble could come from any direction. The peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats thundering down the main street. Mayor Harrison's carriage came to a violent stop in front of the sheriff's office, dust billowing around the wheels like smoke from a funeral pyre. The mayor stumbled out, his usually pristine suit disheveled, his face pale as winter snow. "Sheriff! Sheriff Morrison!" Harrison's voice cracked like a whip in the morning air. "They took him! They took my boy!" Cowboy's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The words hit him like a physical blow, memories flooding back unbidden. A different boy, a different time, but the same desperate fear in a father's voice. Sheriff Morrison emerged from his office, adjusting his badge with deliberate slowness. He was a large man, soft around the middle, with small eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly. Now, Mayor, calm yourself. What exactly happened?" "Tommy was playing in the garden behind our house," Harrison gasped, his hands shaking as he spoke. "Sarah heard horses, shouting. When she looked out, she saw 3 men riding away with my son thrown over one of their saddles like a sack of grain." A crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. Shopkeepers stepped out of their stores, women clutched their shawls tighter, and children pressed closer to their mothers' skirts. The fear was palpable, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Did anyone see which direction they went?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying an odd note of resignation. "Southwest toward Devil's Canyon," Harrison replied. "Sheriff, you have to go after them. You have to bring my boy back." Morrison's eyes darted nervously around the crowd, then back to the mayor. "Now, Mayor, Devil's Canyon is dangerous territory. Those outlaws know every rock and crevice out there. It would be suicide to—" "Suicide?" Harrison's voice rose to a near shriek. "That's my son they have! Your job is to protect this town, to protect our children." "My job is to keep the peace in Redemption Creek," Morrison replied, his voice growing firmer. "I can't risk the lives of my deputies on a wild chase through outlaw territory. We'll send word to the territorial marshal, wait for reinforcements." "Wait?" The word came out as a strangled whisper. "How long will that take? Days? Weeks? What do you think those animals will do to my boy while we wait?" Cowboy set down his coffee cup and stood slowly, his spurs jingling softly as he stepped off the porch. The crowd parted before him like water, their eyes following his every move. He had been in Redemption Creek for 3 months now, keeping to himself, working odd jobs, speaking to no one about his past. But everyone knew there was something different about him, something dangerous and sad. "I'll go," Cowboy said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Morrison's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "This is none of your concern, stranger. This is a matter for the law." "The law seems to be sitting this one out," Cowboy replied, his gaze steady and unwavering. "That boy needs help now, not when it's convenient." "You don't understand," Morrison said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Those men are killers. They'll gut you and leave you for the buzzards without a second thought. Something flickered in Cowboy's eyes, a darkness that made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. I've dealt with killers before, Sheriff, and I've got nothing left to lose. Mayor Harrison grabbed Cowboy's arm, his eyes bright with desperate hope. You'll really go after my son? You'll bring Tommy back? Cowboy looked down at the mayor's hand on his arm, then into the man's eyes. For a moment, he saw another face, younger, more innocent, a face that would never age beyond 8 years old. I'll bring him back, Cowboy said simply, or I'll die trying. The crowd murmured among themselves, some with approval, others with skepticism. Who was this stranger who would risk his life for a child he'd never met? What drove a man to such lengths? Morrison's face had gone pale, and he kept glancing toward the telegraph office as if expecting salvation to arrive at any moment. This is madness, he muttered. Pure madness. Sometimes madness is the only sane response to an insane world, Cowboy replied, already turning toward the livery stable. I'll need supplies, food, water, ammunition. Anything, Harrison said quickly. Whatever you need, it's yours. As Cowboy walked away, the crowd began to disperse, but the whispers followed him like shadows. Some called him a hero, others a fool. But in the back of his mind, Cowboy heard different voices, older voices, from a time when he had failed to be either. At the livery stable, he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Justice. She had been with him for 5 years now, through good times and bad, and she seemed to sense the gravity of what lay ahead. Her ears pricked forward as he checked his rifle, his revolvers, the knife at his belt. You ready for this, girl? He murmured, stroking her neck. It's going to be a hard ride. As he led Justice out into the street, he found Mayor Harrison waiting with a small bag of supplies and a leather pouch heavy with coins. There's more where that came from when you bring Tommy back, Harrison said, pressing the pouch into Cowboy's hands. Cowboy looked at the money for a long moment, then handed it back. Keep your gold, Mayor. Some things can't be bought. He swung up into the saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon toward Devil's Canyon. Somewhere out there, 3 desperate men held a frightened boy, and time was running out. But as he prepared to ride out, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this kidnapping than met the eye. Sheriff Morrison stood in the doorway of his office, watching with an expression that was hard to read. Fear? Guilt? Or something else entirely? Be careful out there, Morrison called out, but his words sounded hollow like an echo in an empty church. Cowboy touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then spurred Justice into a gallop. As the town fell away behind him, he tried to push down the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. But they came anyway, as they always did. A different town, a different time. The sound of gunshots, screaming, chaos in the streets, and a small body lying motionless in the dust, caught in the crossfire of someone else's war. He had failed once. He would not fail again. The desert stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, hiding its secrets beneath layers of sand and stone. But Cowboy had learned to read the desert's language, to see the signs that others missed. And somewhere in that wilderness, a boy was waiting for salvation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Cowboy disappeared into the heat shimmer, becoming one with the legend of the Old West. Behind him, Redemption Creek settled back into its uneasy quiet, But the seeds of revelation had been planted. The truth, like the desert sun, would soon burn away all the shadows. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Cowboy followed the trail southwest of Redemption Creek. 3 horses, one carrying double weight, the signs were clear to his experienced eye. The kidnappers had made no effort to hide their tracks, which struck him as either arrogant or desperate. In his experience, desperate men made dangerous mistakes. Justice picked her way carefully across the rocky terrain, her hooves finding purchase on surfaces that would have challenged a lesser horse. Cowboy's eyes never stopped moving, reading the story written in disturbed stones and bent grass. The trail led steadily toward Devil's Canyon, just as Mayor Harrison had said. But something nagged at him. The kidnappers were moving too slowly, taking too direct a route. Professional outlaws would have split up, used every trick in the book to throw off pursuit. These men were either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident that no one would follow them. As the afternoon wore on, Cowboy came across the first real clue. A piece of torn fabric caught on a thorny mesquite bush, blue cotton that looked like it came from a child's shirt. He dismounted and examined it carefully, his jaw tightening. The boy was alive when they passed this way, but for how long? The trail led into a narrow canyon where the walls rose high on either side, casting blessed shade, but also creating perfect conditions for an ambush. Cowboy dismounted and led Justice on foot, his rifle ready, every sense alert for danger. It was there in the cool shadows of the canyon that he found the first body. The man lay sprawled behind a boulder, a bullet hole in his chest, and a look of surprise frozen on his face. Cowboy knelt beside the corpse, noting the cheap clothes, the worn boots, the calloused hands of a man who worked hard for little pay. This wasn't one of the kidnappers. This was someone else entirely. A search of the body revealed a crumpled piece of paper in the man's shirt pocket. Cowboy smoothed it out, his eyes narrowing as he read the hastily scrawled words. "Meet at the old mine. Bring the boy. M will pay as promised. M." The initial could stand for many names, but in a town the size of Redemption Creek, the possibilities were limited, and the handwriting looked familiar, though Cowboy couldn't quite place where he'd seen it before. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, then continued following the trail. The mystery was deepening with every mile, and he was beginning to suspect that young Tommy Harrison's kidnapping was just the tip of a much larger conspiracy. The trail led out of the canyon and across a stretch of open desert before disappearing into a maze of red rock formations. Here, the kidnappers had finally made an effort to cover their tracks, but they were amateurs at the game. Cowboy found scuff marks on rocks, a hoof print in a patch of soft sand, a broken branch that told him which way they'd gone. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Cowboy spotted smoke rising from behind a cluster of rocks about a mile ahead. He dismounted and pulled out his spyglass, studying the area carefully. 3 men sat around a small fire, their horses picketed nearby. And there, tied to a stunted tree, was a small figure in a blue shirt. Tommy Harrison, alive but clearly terrified. Cowboy studied the kidnappers through his spyglass, memorizing their faces, their weapons, their positions. 2 of them he didn't recognize, but the third made his blood run cold. Scarred face, missing left ear, a distinctive tattoo on his right hand. Jake, the Snake Morrison, one of the most vicious outlaws in the territory. And suddenly the pieces began to fall into place. Morrison, the same last name as the sheriff. Coincidence? In Cowboy's experience, there were no coincidences, only connections waiting to be discovered. He settled in to wait and watch, knowing that patience was often the difference between success and failure. As darkness fell, he crept closer, using every skill he'd learned in his years on the frontier. The kidnappers were confident, careless, talking loudly around their fire. "How much longer we gotta wait out here?" one of them complained, a thin man with nervous eyes. "That kid's been crying for hours." "Shut up, weasel," Jake Morrison snarled. "We wait as long as it takes. The boss said 3 days, and it's only been one. What if someone comes after us?" the third man asked, a heavy-set fellow with a permanent scowl. "That sheriff ain't gonna just sit on his hands forever." Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That sheriff ain't coming after nobody. Trust me on that. He's got too much to lose." Cowboy's jaw tightened. The connection between the kidnappers and Sheriff Morrison was becoming clearer by the minute. But he needed more proof, more evidence of the conspiracy that was beginning to unfold. He waited until the men settled down for the night, leaving only one guard awake. Then he began to move, silent as a shadow, deadly as a striking snake. The guard never knew what hit him. One moment he was staring into the fire, the next he was unconscious on the ground. Cowboy crept toward the tree where Tommy was tied, the boy's eyes wide with terror in the firelight. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, then began cutting the ropes that bound the child. "Are you here to save me?" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's the plan, son," Cowboy replied softly. "But we need to be very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Tommy nodded bravely, and Cowboy felt a familiar ache in his chest. The boy reminded him so much of his own son, the same age, the same courage in the face of fear. They were almost free when Jake Morrison stirred in his sleep, his eyes opening to stare directly at Cowboy. For a moment, time seemed frozen, the two men looking at each other across the dying fire. Then Jake's hand moved toward his gun, and Cowboy knew their time was up. "Well, well," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Look what we got here, boys. Seems like someone didn't get the message about staying away." The other two men jerked awake, scrambling for their weapons. Cowboy pushed Tommy behind the tree and drew his own revolver, the familiar weight of it comforting in his hand. "Let the boy go," Cowboy said quietly. "Your fight's with me now." Jake laughed again, getting to his feet with predatory grace. "My fight? Mister, you just made this personal. See, I know who you are. Word gets around about a man who lost his boy to outlaws. Heard you been hunting us ever since." The words hit Cowboy like physical blows. "You were there," he said, his voice deadly quiet. 5 years ago in Silver Creek, you were part of the gang that robbed the bank." "Guilty as charged," Jake grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "And I remember that little boy who got in the way. Shame about that stray bullet." Rage flooded through Cowboy like liquid fire, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger would get Tommy killed, and he couldn't let that happen. Not again. "Funny thing is," Jake continued, clearly enjoying himself, "here we are again, and there's another little boy in danger. History has a way of repeating itself, don't it?" "Not this time," Cowboy said, and his voice carried the promise of death. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 guns against 1, but Cowboy had advantages they didn't know about. He'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years, and he was ready. When the shooting started, it was over in seconds. Cowboy's first shot took Jake in the chest, spinning him around. His second dropped Weasel before the man could clear leather. The third kidnapper got off one wild shot before Cowboy's bullet found its mark. In the sudden silence that followed, Tommy's sobs seemed unnaturally loud. Cowboy holstered his weapon and knelt beside the boy, pulling him into a protective embrace. "It's over, son," he said gently. "You're safe now." But even as he comforted the child, Cowboy's mind was racing. Jake Morrison was dead, but the conspiracy was far from over. Someone had orchestrated this kidnapping, someone with the initial M who had promised payment for the boy's capture. And Cowboy was beginning to suspect he knew exactly who that someone was. As he prepared to take Tommy home, he searched the kidnapper's belongings, looking for more evidence. What he found made his blood run cold. A letter from Sheriff Morrison outlining the entire plan and promising a share of Mayor Harrison's gold in exchange for the boy's kidnapping. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined, and the most dangerous enemy was the one hiding behind a badge back in Redemption Creek. But now he had proof, and he had the mayor's son. The question was, would anyone believe him when he revealed the truth about their trusted sheriff? The ride back to town would be long and dangerous, but Cowboy was no longer just a man seeking redemption. He was an instrument of justice, and justice would be served. The ride back to Redemption Creek took most of the night, with Tommy clinging to Cowboy's back as Justice picked her way carefully through the darkness. The boy had been brave throughout their escape, but exhaustion and shock were taking their toll. Every few miles, Cowboy would stop to let the child rest and to scan their back trail for signs of pursuit. "Mister," Tommy said during one of their stops, his voice small and uncertain. "Those men said someone in town was paying them, someone who wanted to hurt my pa." Cowboy knelt down to the boy's level, his weathered face gentle in the moonlight. "What exactly did you hear, son?" "They kept talking about the sheriff's plan and how they were going to get rich from my pa's gold. They said the sheriff promised them a big payday if they took me and made my pa scared enough to tell where he hid his money." The confirmation hit Cowboy like a physical blow. Sheriff Morrison wasn't just corrupt, he was the mastermind behind the entire kidnapping plot. But the revelation raised new questions. How long had Morrison been planning this? And what else was he capable of? As they approached the outskirts of Redemption Creek, Cowboy made a decision that would change everything. Instead of riding straight to the mayor's house, he guided Justice toward the old abandoned church on the hill overlooking the town. From there, he could observe the sheriff's office and plan his next move. The church had been empty for years, its congregation scattered to the winds when the silver mine played out. But it provided perfect cover, and Cowboy needed time to think. He settled Tommy in one of the old pews, wrapping the boy in his coat. "I need you to stay here and stay quiet," Cowboy told him. "I'm going to get help, but I have to be careful. There are bad people in town who might try to hurt you again." "You're coming back, right?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with fear. Cowboy felt that familiar ache in his chest, the memory of another boy who had trusted him to keep him safe. "I promise, son. I'll be back before sunrise." He left Tommy with his rifle and enough food and water to last until morning, then made his way down into the town. The streets were empty, most honest folks long since asleep, but lights still burned in the sheriff's office and the saloon. Cowboy crept closer to the sheriff's office, using the shadows to conceal his approach. Through the window, he could see Morrison pacing back and forth, his face flushed with alcohol and anxiety. The sheriff kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the door, clearly expecting someone. that someone arrived just after midnight, a man cowboy recognized as Dutch Henley, one of the territory's most notorious outlaws. The sight of Henley entering the sheriff's office confirmed Cowboy's worst suspicions. Morrison wasn't just corrupt, he was actively working with the criminal element that plagued the territory. Cowboy positioned himself beneath the office window, straining to hear the conversation inside. "Where the hell are they?" Morrison's voice was slurred with drink and tight with worry. "Jake should have been back hours ago with news about the ransom." "Maybe they ran into trouble," Henley replied, his voice calm and measured. "Or maybe that stranger who rode out after them was more dangerous than you thought." "That drifter? He's just one man. Jake Morrison is my cousin. He's handled worse than some broken-down cowboy." Cowboy's blood ran cold. Jake Morrison was the sheriff's cousin. The web of corruption was even more extensive than he'd imagined. "Your cousin's got a big mouth and a small brain," Henley said bluntly. "If he's been captured or killed, this whole operation is blown. We need to cut our losses and get out of town." "No," Morrison slammed his fist on the desk. "I've been planning this for months. Harrison's got a fortune in gold hidden somewhere, and I'm not leaving without it. That sanctimonious bastard acts like he's better than everyone else, but I know he's been skimming from the town treasury for years. And if the boy talks, if he tells people what he heard, then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to talk." The casual way Morrison discussed murdering a child made Cowboy's trigger finger itch, but he forced himself to remain calm, to gather more evidence. The conversation continued for another hour, revealing the full scope of Morrison's crimes. The sheriff had been embezzling from the town treasury for years, using his position to cover up his thefts. When he learned about Mayor Harrison's private gold reserves, he'd hatched the kidnapping plot to force the mayor to reveal the location of his wealth. The plan was to split the gold with his outlaw allies, then disappear into Mexico before anyone discovered the truth. But now, with Jake Morrison missing and the kidnapping failed, the sheriff was getting desperate, and desperate men did desperate things. As dawn approached, Cowboy made his way back to the church, his mind racing with plans. He had enough evidence to expose Morrison's crimes, but he needed to be careful about how he revealed the truth. A corrupt sheriff with outlaw allies was a dangerous enemy, especially when cornered. Tommy was awake when Cowboy returned, huddled in the pew with the rifle across his knees. The boy's face lit up with relief when he saw Cowboy's familiar silhouette in the doorway. "I heard horses during the night," Tommy whispered. "Lots of them riding around town." Cowboy's jaw tightened. Morrison was mobilizing his criminal allies, preparing for a final confrontation. The situation was about to get much more dangerous. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Cowboy said, kneeling beside the boy. "Your father is in danger, and so is everyone else in town. The sheriff is working with the bad men who took you, and they're planning something terrible." "Sheriff Morrison?" Tommy's eyes went wide with disbelief. "But he's supposed to protect people. Sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the worst," Cowboy replied sadly. "But we're going to stop them. I'm going to get you to your father, and then we're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." As they prepared to leave the church, Cowboy heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, he could see a group of riders surrounding the building. Morrison and at least 6 outlaws, all heavily armed. "Come out, stranger," Morrison's voice echoed across the hillside. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got the boy. Let's talk this through like civilized men." Cowboy checked his weapons, his mind calculating odds and angles. 7 men against 1, with a child to protect. The situation looked hopeless, but he'd faced worse odds before. "What do you want, Morrison?" Cowboy called back, stalling for time. "I want the boy, and I want you to forget everything you think you know about what happened out there in the desert. Do that, and you can ride out of here alive. And if I refuse," Morrison's laugh was cold and ugly, "then you'll end up like your son did 5 years ago, dead in the dirt because you couldn't mind your own business." The words hit Cowboy like a physical blow, but they also revealed something important. Morrison knew about his past, which meant the sheriff had been investigating him, preparing for this confrontation. "You made one mistake, Morrison," Cowboy called out. "You trusted your cousin Jake to keep his mouth shut. But dead men tell no tales, and Jake told me everything before he died." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Morrison's voice came back, tight with rage and fear. "You're lying. Jake's not dead. He's too smart to get taken down by a washed-up gunfighter. Check your facts, Sheriff. Jake Morrison died last night, along with his 2 partners. And before he died, he told me all about your little arrangement. The embezzlement, the kidnapping plot, the plan to steal Mayor Harrison's gold. I know it all." Another long silence, then the sound of hushed conversation among the outlaws. Cowboy could imagine Morrison's panic, the realization that his carefully laid plans were crumbling around him. "Last chance, stranger," Morrison finally called out. "Send out the boy, and maybe we can work something out." Cowboy looked down at Tommy, seeing the trust and fear warring in the child's eyes. In that moment, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "The only thing I'm sending out is justice," Cowboy replied, "and it's coming for all of you." The battle for Redemption Creek was about to begin, and only one side would survive to see the sunrise. The standoff at the old church stretched through the early morning hours, with Morrison and his outlaws surrounding the building while Cowboy and Tommy remained trapped inside. But Cowboy had faced impossible odds before, and he'd learned that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. Using the church's bell tower as a vantage point, Cowboy studied the positions of Morrison's men. They were spread out in a rough circle, confident in their numbers, but careless in their positioning. Professional soldiers would have been more careful, but these were outlaws and corrupt lawmen, used to intimidating rather than fighting. "Tommy," Cowboy whispered, "I need you to do something very important for me. See that loose board in the back wall? I want you to crawl through there and make your way down to town. Find your father and tell him everything you heard those men say about Sheriff Morrison." "But what about you?" Tommy asked, his voice trembling with fear. "I'm going to keep these men busy while you get help, but you have to be brave, son. Can you do that for me?" Tommy nodded, his young face set with determination that reminded Cowboy painfully of his own lost son. As the boy crawled through the gap in the wall, Cowboy began his own preparations for what might be his final battle. The first shot came just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, Morrison's patience finally exhausted. The bullet splintered wood near Cowboy's head, and suddenly, the morning air was filled with the thunder of gunfire. Cowboy moved like a man possessed, using every trick he'd learned in 20 years of frontier warfare. He fired from different windows, creating the illusion of multiple defenders. He used the church's thick stone walls for cover, picking off Morrison's men one by one with carefully aimed shots. But even as he fought, Cowboy knew he was fighting a losing battle. His ammunition was limited, and Morrison's men were slowly closing in. It was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed his position. That's when he heard the sound that changed everything, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, not from Morrison's direction, but from the town below. Through the church window, Cowboy could see a group of riders racing up the hill, led by Mayor Harrison himself. Tommy had made it through. Help was coming. But Morrison had heard the approaching riders too, and his response was swift and vicious. "Burn them out!" he screamed to his men. "Torch the church and end this!" One of the outlaws produced a bottle of whiskey and a burning rag, preparing to throw it through the church window. But before he could complete the throw, a rifle shot from the approaching riders took him down. The battle became a three-way fight, with Morrison's outlaws caught between Cowboy's position in the church and the townsmen approaching from below. But Morrison himself had one last card to play. "Harrison!" the corrupt sheriff shouted, his voice carrying across the hillside. "Call off your men, or I'll put a bullet in your precious church and everyone in it." Mayor Harrison reined in his horse, his face pale with fear and rage. Behind him rode a dozen of the town's most respected citizens, all armed and ready for a fight. But at Morrison's threat, they hesitated. "You're finished, Morrison," Harrison called back. "My son told me everything. The whole town knows what you've done." "Maybe so," Morrison replied, "but I'm not going down alone. That stranger in the church killed my cousin, and I'm going to return the favor. Then I'm going to disappear with enough gold to live like a king in Mexico." It was then that Cowboy made his move. Using the confusion of the standoff, he slipped out of the church through the same gap Tommy had used, circling around behind Morrison's position. The corrupt sheriff was so focused on the townsmen below that he never saw death approaching from behind. "Morrison," Cowboy said quietly. The sheriff spun around, his gun already in his hand, but Cowboy was faster. The shot echoed across the hillside like thunder, and Morrison crumpled to the ground, his weapon unfired. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The battle for Redemption Creek was over, but the revelations were just beginning. As the townspeople secured the prisoners, Mayor Harrison approached Cowboy, his eyes bright with gratitude and curiosity. "I don't know how to thank you," Harrison said. "You saved my son's life and exposed a conspiracy that could have destroyed our town. But I have to ask, who are you really? What brought you to Redemption Creek?" Cowboy looked out over the town spread below them, then back at the mayor. For 5 years he'd carried his grief and guilt like a stone in his chest. But maybe it was time to let it go. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said quietly. 5 years ago, I was a deputy marshal in Silver Creek. During a bank robbery, my 8-year-old son was caught in the crossfire and killed by a stray bullet. One of the robbers was Jake Morrison, the man I killed last night. The crowd that had gathered around them fell silent, absorbing the weight of his words. "I've been hunting Morrison's gang ever since," Cowboy continued. "Not for justice, but for revenge. I thought killing them would somehow bring my boy back, or at least ease the pain. But when I saw your son in danger, I realized something important." "What's that?" Harrison asked softly. "That saving a life means more than taking one. That redemption comes not from dwelling on the past, but from protecting the future." As if summoned by his words, Tommy appeared at his father's side, his young face bright with hero worship. "Pa, this is the man who saved me," Tommy said. "He's the bravest person I ever met." Cowboy knelt down to the boy's level, his weathered face gentle. "You were pretty brave yourself, son. Running through enemy territory to get help. That took real courage. Will you stay in Redemption Creek?" Tommy asked hopefully. "We could use a real lawman here." Cowboy looked around at the faces surrounding him, honest people who had just learned that their trusted sheriff was a criminal, who needed someone they could depend on to protect them. "I reckon I could stay for a while," he said finally. "This town needs a new sheriff, and I need a new purpose." The cheer that went up from the crowd echoed across the desert, a sound of hope and renewal that seemed to chase away the shadows of the past. Later that day, as the territorial marshal arrived to take the surviving outlaws into custody, the full scope of Morrison's crimes became clear. The corrupt sheriff had been embezzling from the town treasury for years, using his position to cover up his thefts and protect his criminal allies. His plan to kidnap Tommy and force Mayor Harrison to reveal the location of his gold reserves was just the latest in a series of increasingly desperate schemes. But Morrison's corruption had also inadvertently led to his own downfall. His greed had brought him into contact with Jake Morrison and his gang, the same outlaws who had killed Cowboy's son 5 years earlier. In trying to use them for his own purposes, Morrison had set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately destroy him. As the sun set over Redemption Creek, Cowboy stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, a new badge gleaming on his chest. The weight of it felt strange after years of wandering, but it also felt right. Tommy Harrison appeared at his side, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing a smile that could have lit up the entire territory. "Sheriff Carter," the boy said formally, then broke into a grin. "That sounds pretty good, doesn't it?" "It does indeed, son," Cowboy replied, accepting the coffee with a smile of his own. "It does indeed." For the first time in 5 years, Samuel Carter, no longer just Cowboy, felt like he had found his way home. The past would always be with him, but it no longer defined him. He had found his redemption not in revenge, but in service to others. And in the growing twilight of the Old West, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The town of Redemption Creek had lived up to its name, offering salvation not just to a grieving father, but to a man who had lost his way in the darkness of grief and rage. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, Sheriff Samuel Carter knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect the innocent and serve justice. But tonight, for the first time in years, he would sleep peacefully, knowing that he had finally found his purpose again. The cowboy had become a lawman, the wanderer had found a home, and the man who had lost everything had discovered that sometimes saving others was the only way to save yourself. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the desert like a song of redemption. And in the town of Redemption Creek, honest people slept safely in their beds, protected by a man who had learned that true justice came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The legend of the lone cowboy who faced deadly outlaws for the mayor's son would be told for generations, but the man himself was content to be simply Sheriff Carter, protector of the peace and guardian of the innocent. And that, perhaps, was the greatest transformation of all. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.